6. Spymaster. I'm disappointed we couldn't hear the finale of the speech. Bloodletter Sinduk, high priest of the Shoshotlan temple complex, told them over his wine. It was delivered with such care. It seems a shame to have missed the climax. I am grateful, but you didn't miss much, Ichtak assured him. The ending was all echoes. Honest echoes, but echoes. Every speech on this excursion is felt like a mirror to the last. Besides, I'm glad your men acted when they did. As am I, Sinduk smiled, the friendly features of the old Lautani holy man dismissing any remnants of the aloof feline expressions for which his kind were famed. Regardless, the Southland is fortunate to have its brothers in the faith as a shield. The years under the Duumvirate were not kind to us. The Crown means to ensure you enjoy the same protection as your canine brothers in the faith to the north, Ichtak told him. After all that has transpired, we are in this together now. Sinduk nodded, saying, I only mourn that there are those among the Lautani who still refuse to see that. He took a bite of the clingy rice and curry beneath him in the fashion of the Lautani, using his bare hands to retrieve the food with effortless ease. Ichtak enjoyed the sweet flavors of the colorful Southland meal, for it made a welcome change from the Spartan carnivorous diet of Sholoshaishan warrior tradition to which he clung, but he envied the native's ability to not look like a fool while he ate it without utensils. Too many of us were dragged off into penance and renunciation during the dark days to willingly wish to go back now, when we can at last study Harakwe's word undisturbed, Sinduk said. It is sad to see how quickly many of the young forget. They'll learn that the new system is not simply the old system reborn if we give them enough time, Akoat said from his own seat at the table, nursing a meal he seemed hesitant to eat. When generations to come have known nothing but the luxury of the Empire, they won't have the motivation to try and burn it down. Ichtak was still not over his amazement at how different his Harlequin friend seemed to become the second he found himself in the company of his fellow clergymen. Devout he certainly was, but knowing the man behind the robe made it difficult for Ichtak to square Akoat the priest with Akoat the individual. Still, he supposed he shifted just as readily when the time to hobnob came about. Institutions and ranks have a way of inspiring that in you, he thought. The room in which they sat was the dining hall of the local villa they had occupied for their stay in Shoshotlan. Open-walled Lautani architecture let the not-so-distant ocean breeze waft in, brought some 20 miles over hill and dense rainforest to the noses of the diners at the table. The sea was never far off in this land, Ichtak had realized, and though he could appreciate the beauty of the southern Estlan Peninsula, he longed to see the moon and stars above his sparse homeland in the arid highland deserts once more. The humidity here felt so thick upon the air that he was certain it slowed him down. The Lautani locals, unperturbed, sipped spicy wines that made Ichtak pant at the thought, with Sinduk downing the last of his large glass in silent toast to Akoat's sentiment, while the prince looked on with staid amazement. How a kindred with fur stood the heat so well, he did not understand. We can only pray, Sinduk offered, raising his empty glass. The two other Lautani priests in attendance mimicked the motion, with Akoat and the prince following their example. Ichtak let silence fall before asking the question he'd summoned them here to ask, ensuring his tone was miles removed from any inquisitorial threats as he formed the question. High Marshal Ruhalpa will have had Ektal agents question you, Ichtak said. I trust you've passed any information along to him on the source of your tip about the temple's visitor this morning. However, I'd like to hear it from you first before I read it in an Ektal missive. I want to know who I'm indebted to. We aren't certain, Sinduk said, his fellows at the table nodding. Brother Basuk found a letter pinned to the gate into the garden complex around dawn. It had the seal of a fairly powerful Marga on it, but that hardly narrows it down. A clan that size would have 1,000 and more sons scattered across the peninsula, and any of them could have left the note. Interesting, Ichtak said. Which Marga? The Horabaya Marga, Sinduk told him, using the proper Lautani clan title. He leaned back in his seat, eyes wandering the table, musing. They're the clan that holds sway over Horabaya, Estlan now, and all the surrounding towns south of here. The very same one from which the royal family was chosen by the Tlatoani. A very powerful group of families indeed. It's intriguing, but I've thought all through the day that your Lautani dialect is strikingly similar to Horabaya speech. These city's folk must have made as deep an impression upon you as you made upon them, your majesty. Ichtak smiled and nodded, hoping the Lautani language challenged Akoat didn't recall that no such stops around reconquered Estlan had been made on this reconstruction expedition. His friend knew little, if anything, of his proximity to Setiawan, and he meant to keep it that way, especially if his suspicions about this tip turned out to be true. I'll have to make my thanks known the next time I'm in the region, Ichtak said. Akoat, perhaps thinking ahead to the fast-approaching flower wars in the early spring, offered to spar with Ichtak after their guests had been dismissed for the night, but the prince meant to meditate on the day. The priest seemed to take the hint and left his friend to brood alone. Ichtak waited until the villa had slowed to a midnight crawl. During this lull, he pinned a short and vaguely worded letter for Setiawan, urging him to indicate in private whether it was he that relayed the tip about the temple's unwanted visitor that afternoon. The letter aimed to keep any unofficial network of social contacts Setiawan's clan might possess secret, at least for the time being. Once he was certain, then he could weigh who needed to know. If the number of people who were aware of this backroom channel was kept as small as was possible, then the chances of it being compromised were minimal. Perhaps more importantly, though, it was vital in Ichtak's mind not to be seen visiting his physician's apprentice alone during the night. A silent slip of the letter under the door followed by a quick retreat should keep the errand simple, and prevent the fretful Ruhualpa from having to suffer some shocked seizure at the thought of an imagined clandestine rendezvous on the part of his royal charge. Halls empty and doors barred, the subdued walk through the main body of the villa was easy enough. The transfer to the annex of the property where his retinue of priests and physicians was housed took a little more planning, with the prince lurking in the mouth of a corridor, until several Ektal door guards took a smoke break in the garden before slipping across the large entry hall. Ichtak had never visited this wing himself, but knew from Setiawan's descriptions which of the doors on the second floor must belong to him. Approaching, he used all the care he could muster not to let the paper scratch along the tiles of the floor as it coasted under the door, crouched low and looking the part of a demolitionist measuring powder for a dangerous payload. Large as he was, his silhouette lurking low to the ground would have been a clownish sight. Ichtak had almost begun to breathe easy in relief at a job well done when the door slid noiselessly open, halfway through his first step away down the hall. "I thought I heard someone out here," the feline said, the grin evident in his tone. "What's this, Your Grace?" Setiawan held up the folded paper. Ichtak, fast motioning for silence, pushed into the small room past him, waving for the feline to shut the door behind them. "Don't you sleep?" "Not well," Setiawan said, muffling his words as he pointed Ichtak to a chair along the wall. A single lamp glowed pale from the writing desk nearby, and Setiawan pulled the chair away to sit alongside him. "I can see," Ichtak said, looking over the scrawled and scattered papers on the desk. "I was happy to hear you made it back safely today," Setiawan commented, following the prince's eye over to the desk. I was worried this morning. I was getting ready to come see you myself, but I decided against distracting you from dinner. Twice in one day would have been a little much.
You made use of the time, though, Ichtak said, nodding for the papers. Pinning verses?
Nothing ready to be read, Setiawan chuckled. Much less sung.
Ichtak had been guessing, half joking about the Lautani propensity for poetry and song. He had seen Setiawan with bound journals before, but had always assumed they were for notes on anatomy or medicine, something pertaining to his studies as a physician's apprentice. The prince wondered what Setiawan's weightless speech, so reminiscent to him of birdsong with its rising and falling tones, sounded like in song. Setiawan spoke before he could dwell on the notion for long, though.
Has the Tlatoani's house started writing its own poetry?
Setiawan held aloft the letter for emphasis. Not quite, said Ichtak, smirking. I had questions about what Bloodletter Sinduk from the Shoshotlan temple told me at dinner tonight about the warning they received. A letter with your clan's mark, he said. Setiawan frowned, his countenance falling a bit, as if expecting trouble.
I didn't mean to stir anything up, he said. I was just fretting.
It was you who left the letter? Setiawan nodded. It may have saved me today, Ichtak told him. The Ektal say the priesthood at the temple heightened security for the speech. They found a gun on a visitor who attempted to slip in during the meeting. The Ektal might have caught it even if the priests hadn't, but who knows? We're keeping it quiet for now, until we can determine whether the man was alone. Ichtak leaned forward, grinning in an attempt to assuage Setiawan's widening eyes, and said, If you did stir something up, then it needed to be stirred up. So, insufficient as it might be, thank you.
Any time, Your Grace,
Setiawan chuckled. It was a silent relief to see the feline's easy smile restored. I have a favor to ask, Ichtak told him.
Anything you need.
Keep in touch with your clan, Ichtak said. I will begin to send your mail stamped with my imperial seal through Ektal couriers, safe from any prying eyes. Let them know that I'm grateful.
Eyes and ears for the dais?
Exactly, Ichtak nodded. Unofficial and impossible to pin down. If Horabaya Marga will help Sholoshaidi, I'd be glad to have Spymaster Setiawan and his clan on my side. Setiawan laughed, waving the title away.
Far too much, he said. I've told you, you should just call me Seti.
I'll start when you stop calling me Your Grace, Spymaster Seti.
I'll try and remember, Your Highness.
They talked long into the night, about everything from Lautani music to Sholoshaishan history, about the locations Ichtak planned to visit on his pre-coronation tour of the broader empire after his business reigning in Estlan province was done, and about the upcoming flower wars in Tepeklan. They only abated when the approaching dawn made Ichtak aware of how much harder each minute made it to exit this wing of the villa unseen. He rose to go, following Setiawan to the door, but the slight feline turned before they arrived, looking up to meet his gaze.
Be careful,
he urged again, so close his sing-song accent made Ichtak's ears twitch.
Whether I've given you warnings or not, just be careful.
His small hand came out to rest on Ichtak's chest. There were no buttons to fix this time, and no medals to align. Their gazes stayed locked there for an excruciating moment, the towering Ichtak's one blue orb cast down to meet slight Setiawan's turquoise eyes. The tension between them seemed almost to freeze the everlasting chatter of the jungle outside. Ichtak suddenly found it difficult to breathe. Setiawan's free hand found Ichtak's neck, and their lips met, the feline going up on his toes as Ichtak, despite his better judgment shrieking out for him to leave, stooped down to meet him, closing his lone eye and feeling the world beyond them dissolve. For one moment, there was no guilt over his survival at Estlan, or worry over the Empire's future, or shame about the cloud beneath which he led his life. There was only Setiawan. But then reality crashed back down upon him. The voice of Ruhualpa seemed to echo in his mind. "You are not your own man," it said. "Your life is not your own." Ichtak tried to think of a way to disengage, but for a frantic second found himself unable to act at all. It was Setiawan who pulled away first, eyes downcast, taking a step away in flustered silence to clear a path for the door. "I'm so sorry, Your Majesty," he muttered, shaking his head, frightened. "That was irresponsible. I shouldn't have assumed." Ichtak closed the gap between them again, but it was only a fraternal hand on the shoulder he extended. "Don't apologize, Seti," Ichtak said. "I have to go." "I wish you could stay." "So do I," Ichtak said. They stood close in silence for a moment before Ichtak slipped out of the door, eye glinting in the light of the moon spilling through the window as he scanned the nocturnal hall for signs of life. With a last look back to Setiawan in the doorway, he padded off down the corridor towards his chamber, somehow simultaneously more certain of himself than he had ever been, and mortally worried he had just taken the first tragic stumble into yet another failure.